All right, so we are now going to talk about mental ray proxies. And what I have open right now is a scene that we looked at earlier when we started talking about onyx broadleaf, where I have a bunch of different onyx broadleaf trees that are imported that are instanced onto some particles, just regular instances. And the polygon count is 244 million. And if I go to render view, this is the render. And so basically we can see that, as I've been saying all along, that rendering anywhere from, 200 million, 500 million polys with instancing isn't an issue as long as you have enough RAM to render the core polygons. And so again, as a reminder, what that means is that in this scene, these trees, if I make them visible, the original trees that are instanced, are 3.5 million polys. And that's not a lot for a mental ray with 12 gigs of RAM, which is what I have. And so basically I can instance these 3 million polys a bunch of times, and to the point where in this scene I have 250 million polys worth. And it doesn't really take a lot more RAM to render 250 million polys as it takes to render the original 3 million. That's the benefit of instancing. But there does come a point where you will run out of RAM, and Maya or mental ray will just start to act wonky. And so in my experience with the amount of RAM that I have, it seems that once I get to around 700 million polygons, that I hit that barrier. And so to pass the barrier, you want to switch to mental ray proxies. And so there's positives and negatives. And so the positives of instances like we have in here is that I can, switch them to bounding box mode, meaning that I can still, tumble around my scene no problem. So let me just go and increase my far clipping plane. So as we've seen, we can instance around no problem, but the preview we see is just a bunch of boxes. But of course, I can always go to the instancer node and switch it to geometry. And even with 250 million polys, I'll be able to do that. So the benefit really is the fact that you can see the geometry in the scene, which allows you to, just make aesthetic decisions over the composition of your shot a little bit more intuitively, because I can really see what's in there. Once you switch to proxies, you lose that ability. What you gain, however, is a couple things. One is you can render a lot more polygons, and two is your scene size can actually get a lot smaller, because the scene size for this scene, is probably, let's take a look, Onyx Trees B03, 350 megs, not that big because it's about 3 million polys. But once I get into proxies, which is in here somewhere, we can see that in these files, which are proxy files, I still have 350 megs for the scene file because I still have all the original trees in there. But this file, which we'll get to, has all the original trees, but then this one only has the proxy files. It renders exactly the same with a few billion polygons, but the file size is only 8 megabytes. So basically, the advantage of proxies, your scene size can get smaller if you delete the original trees, and you can render more polys. So how do proxies work? So, well, basically, it's really simple. So if I go and make a new scene, so I've got nothing in here, and then I'm going to go and let's actually open a scene where we do have a couple trees, though. So let's just go to Onyx Trees B02. All right. And so in this scene, it's already set up with physical sun and sky, so that's why I chose this one. So let's just grab, one of these trees as an example. So let's say we choose that one. So I'm just going to delete all the other trees in here. So we have this one tree, which is 168,000 polys. And if I put it to 0, 0, 0, it's at the origin. All right. So, and let's get rid of those. So simple scene. So with this tree, which is, at the origin at 0, 0, 0, obviously it'll render no problem and I can instance it. But if I want to make a proxy, then basically what you do is you take your tree and you export it as a mental ray proxy. And then you can make something like a cube, and then in the attribute editor tell it that when it renders as this proxy file that's on disk. So the issue though is that all of the shaders that are on this tree, and so the shader for the bark and the shader for the leaves, gets embedded into the mental ray proxy file. And then on your actual object that you're using as a proxy, you can't go and change those. So I'll show you what I mean. So let's say I want to create a low-res stand-in for this tree. It could be just a cube, but what I recommend doing is, if I create a cube like so, and say I go and scale it up, then let's just go make a new camera. And I've got this cube in here, and I'm going to grab that face and go to polygons, and let's say I go in and extrude the face, and Control E is my hotkey. So I'll hit Control E, and I'll move this up a little bit, and move this that way, and then Control E, and move that up, and scale it like so. So I'm kind of creating something that kind of matches the overall bounding box shape of this tree. So sort of scooting things around. So let's say this is kind of like a stand-in for this tree. General, simple, low res. So as opposed to the instancer where I've got a just a bounding box, here I have something that's only 22 polygons. And I have no construction history. Construction history is off right now. And so what I want to do is this cube right now, I'm going to take it and, let's say I, move its pivot point to the origin and freeze transform, modify, freeze transformations. And so meaning that my tree is at 0, 0, 0 in my little proxy object. So I'm going to copy that. And on my little cube, paste proxy. All right. So then what I want to do is I need to export my actual tree as a proxy file. So I'm going to go to File, Export Selection, and then in the options, go to Mental Ray. So if I hit Reset, go to Mental Ray, then in here, Export Selection Output, you want to choose Render Proxy. And then all of the other settings we're going to leave at the defaults. And so importantly, we want it to export materials. And so the shaders that are assigned to this geometry will be included in the Mental Ray proxy file that's created. So if I hit Export Selection, then in my project, where you put it is up to you. So if I go to Mental Ray, you can see I created a directory called Proxies, and I have a bunch of proxies inside here. And so I could create a new directory called Proxies for the tutorial. And then in here, I would want to obviously take the time to name things so I know what I'm doing. And when I refer to these things and import them back in, I know what they are. So I'm going to hit Save. And now that that's done, I can take my tree, I can hide it, and now I just have this cube in here. And then what I'm going to do is actually before we bring the proxy in, let's hide the cube and get our tree visible. And let's go in and just do a render just so we see what this tree looks like. So indirect lighting, final gather. And let me just lower the settings down and quality 1. And that all looks normal, 720p. Okay, let me just do a render. Render. All right, so that tree is rendering. And then once it's done, I'm just going to save the image. And then now I'm going to hide this tree and then my little proxy object I'll make visible. And then you're going to go to the attribute editor. And then in the attribute editor on the shape node, you can see you have Mental Ray. And in here is something that says render proxy. And that's where you can go and browse. And I will go to my Mental Ray folder and proxies tutorial, and there's that MI file. So I exported a .mi file, which is basically the geometry and the shaders for that tree. So if I hit open, then you'll notice that your proxy kind of shifted a little bit. And let's get the original tree visible again. So what happens is that it takes this object and it kind of scoots it so that the bounding box of this object matches the bounding box of the tree. And so what I do is after I select the proxy file, when it scoots around a little bit, I then go in and I just sit and get a little bit more anal over matching it. So that's kind of matching. And I can go in if I want to and do that. And then from this point of view, scoot it a little bit. And scoot it a little bit. So that now it's a better approximation. Inside here, let's maybe grab those and scoot those a little bit. So it's pretty much matching the overall shape of this tree. I could take this guy and scoot that in a little bit. Scoot that in a little bit. So just trying to get it to match the overall shape, which is useful. Okay. And then for it, since it's scooted a little bit, what I also do is also reset the pivot point to the origin. So that's there. Okay. So my proxy object has now been assigned its render proxy. I've now taken a little bit more time to make sure that it matches the overall shape. And again, it's at 0, 0, 0 with its pivot point at the origin. So I know that this proxy and the tree that it represents are truly lining up with each other. And if I now take my tree and I hide it, I could also delete it, by the way. The only thing I have in the scene right now is this simple low-res version of my tree. And now let's go to the render view window, save our last render, and render again. And what you'll see is the tree is still there. And so just going to let that render. So that's basically render proxies. So it's really, really simple to set up. And so inside here, if I changed my camera rotation a little bit, but you can see it's identical. That tree is sitting in the exact same place as it was before. It's just my camera tumbled a little bit. And it looks the same. The shaders are reacting the same, reacting to final gather, reacting to my lighting. But I'm only rendering this. So I could actually delete this tree if I wanted to. But the caveat to think about with render proxies is that if I want to change the shader on this tree right now, I can't. And so what I would have to do is, which is a reason to keep the originals around if you want to, is that I then would have to, if I have the original still in the scene, go to Hypershade. I can delete unused in here. Here's the shader that's on the leaves for that tree. I can make a change to the shader, but then I would need to re-export this file as a new Mental Ray proxy. And then if I export it with the same name, then this object will use the correct thing. So I can't directly edit the shader, meaning this object that's rendering as my tree just has a Lambert shader on it. So if I go to render Hypershade and graph, you can see that the shader that's assigned to your render proxy object is irrelevant. It's rendering the object you saved to disk. So if I take this cube right now and I make a copy of it. So edit, just a regular copy, and I move that, and let's say I rotate it, and I make another copy, and I move it, and I scale it, and I rotate it, make another copy. Then basically all of these copies that I'm making, if we now go to the render view window and launch a render, those simple low-res 22 polygon cubes are going to render as my trees. So mental ray proxies are really simple. And so there you go. You can see reacting to reflections and casting shadows, and with your proxies you can scale them, you can rotate them, and the object will respect the scale and rotation that you have applied to the object. So that's it. So you can see that if I were to take my original tree that's in here and delete it and go to Hypershade and delete unused. So the only thing in here is a Lambert shader and the MIA material that's on the ground. And I go in, and we can go and grab these four and make another copy of them. And let me just increase the clipping plane on my camera. That if I go and launch render, even though the original tree is not in the scene anymore, and the shader has been deleted, that it's still going to render that tree, just because it's referencing it from the file that's on disk. And so you can already see that it's working. So there you go. So final gather points pop in, and now I have a bunch of trees. And so the thing with proxies is that from a RAM perspective, it's far more efficient. And so it's basically going to allow you to render billions of polygons. I could now make thousands of copies of this tree, and it will render without a problem. The thing is you don't get an accurate poly count for your scene like you do with instancing. Right now, it's telling me I only have 282 polys inside here, although I know that since I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these trees inside here, and the original tree was whatever it was, 100,000 polys, and we're rendering about 1 million polys. But the RAM footprint is just what one tree would be. And that's mental ray proxies. And there you go. So it's really cool and really simple. So if we jump to another scene, so let me just go and go back here, because now you've seen the basics of using proxies, then everything from this point is pretty straightforward. So I just need to switch to a different project. Let's go to proxies. Give me a second to find it. That's that one. There we go. So this one is still 350 megs only because I still have the original tree in here. So if we go in here, then what I'm doing is that here's my original trees, and then for each one I created a proxy version. So you can see these are all named _proxy. So if I make them visible, you can see they're all at 000 at the origin. But if I grab any of them, you can see that I, kind of size them to match the tree that they're referring to. And then I take these proxies and I instance them onto particles, just like we've been doing. So if I look at my instancer node, you can see everything that's on it is these proxy objects. Proxy, 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 proxy. So if I rewind and hit play, and I go to my instancer node, which right now is set to bounding box, and I set it to geometry, then you can see that as far as hardware is concerned, I only have 21,000 polys in the scene. But what we know is that, and again, let me just change my far clipping plane. So the cool thing with proxies is that it gives you a, as long as you take the time to have your proxy geometry kind of match the shape of the tree, then I can stumble around, and it's kind of like bounding boxes, but even cooler, because I actually can see the shape of each of those individual trees in there. But it's far more interactive. But each of these are going to render as the high-res trees, which are saved out as MI files. And so again, if I go in here to a proxy, you can see that under Mental Ray, it's specified which proxy to use. So each one of these you can see is using a different .mi file. So if I then go in and render, or let's go to the render view window, then this is our render with instances, and then this is a render with proxies. And so the render that I have here, I made the tree scale a little bit smaller and increased the number of particles so I would have more trees. So this render that we're looking at right now is this one, which is 1.5 billion polys. So that's what we're looking at right here, is over 1 billion polygons worth of trees. So there's a lot of geometry inside here. Rendering, with physical sun, sky, final gather, volume fog, all working with no problem. So, which is really, really cool. Then if I go back to the render view window, and let's say we open the next scene, so Onyx Proxies 02, let that load. So it's taking a while to load because I still have all the original trees in here. You can see I just made the trees even smaller. So now I've got 6,000 trees. And so my proxy trees are what are being instanced. My original trees, I still have in the scene in case I want to change a shader and re-export it. But again, my original trees are 3.5 million polygons for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 trees. So 15 trees is 3.5 million. So I have 6,000 trees in the scene. So if I go in and say, well, if I've got 6,000 trees in the scene, divided by 15 times 3.5 million is 1.4 billion polygons that would be rendered. And so that's, so this scene that I have right now, just hide the original trees, is this image. And the render time is not that bad. So my render times with proxies versus instances is about the same. So meaning that rendering 200 million versus rendering over 1 billion polygons takes about the same amount of time to render, which is bizarre, but it's true. So meaning that this image that's 1280 by 720 is probably a 10-minute render, maybe 15 minutes. And that's, again, because I'm using, low-res anti-aliasing and final gather settings. But just for test rendering, to be able to test render, over 1 billion polygons in that amount of time is awesome. And if we go to the next image, you can see I made the trees even smaller. And so the polygon count in this render is 4.2 billion polygons. So 4.2 billion. So if I take my particle object in here, then, or that's probably the next save, so Onyx Proxies 03. Onyx Proxies 03. And let this load. And wait, because it still has all the original trees in there. Then in here, actually this one is a different render, which I'll show you, which is even more polygons. But render view window, so 250 million polys, 1.4 billion, 4.2 billion. So obviously, if from an artistic point of view, it's kind of a boring image just because it's not designed. I just filled a piece of geometry with a bunch of trees. It would look a lot better, obviously, if I designed this thing and thought about, art direction, composition, and all that kind of stuff. But this was just me wanting to see how many polygons I could render. So this one was 4.2, and then this render, which is the scene file I have here, if I rewind and hit play, we can see I've got a lot of proxies in here. So this particle object, which is this instancer node, has 21,000 trees. And then this one, which is the instancer node back there, has 28,000 trees on it. So 21,000 plus 28,000. So with 49,000 trees in here, then again, it's a lot of polygons. So if we go into render view, that's this image. So this one is this one. So that's 11 billion. And this is the most I've tried to render. Once I rendered this one and it rendered without a problem, I was like, all right, well, I don't need that many polygons. So there you go. I think the point is that you can basically render a crazy amount of polygons with proxies. This render of my 12 gigs of RAM took about half the RAM. So I still had 6 gigs free of RAM while this was rendering. So that really means that I could actually have, obviously a lot more trees that are being sent to the instancer, or just copy this. So I really don't know what the poly limit is because I haven't tried more than 11 billion because that's just silly. So, just the fact that each one of these is real, geometry, just sort of shows you that with a little bit of art direction, and in the scene, that creating these kind of vistas that go off to the horizon with, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of trees, each one being, 100,000 polys each or more, is doable. So I haven't tried to create a project for a personal project yet or anything for work that has that necessity, but I just felt it was important for the purpose of this DVD just to show you that it was possible and how to use Mental Ray Proxies. So the images I'm showing you in and of themselves aren't super pretty, but I think that they get the point across that Mental Ray is pretty cool. So in the sense that, over the years, they've definitely not been sitting idly by while V-Ray chomps on their heels. So, V-Ray is obviously an excellent renderer as well. And, V-Ray proxies have been something that people have been talking about on the internet for a while. So when Mental Ray finally added proxies, that was very welcome. And I just never had a big need to use them. I did use them on an architectural thing about 3 years ago, and I was rendering about 50 million polys worth of trees, and it was working, but it was a little slow. And so over the last 3 or 4 years, the render time increase of rendering proxies with Final Gather has increased dramatically. Like there's no way that 3 or 4 years ago, based on what I was experiencing, that I could render 11 billion polys. So it's really, really awesome. So yeah, so one of these days, hopefully I'll be able to take advantage of it and do something that has that necessity. But, if you think about it, I mean, just the fact that I could have, all sorts of paint effects plants and rocks and trees and everything's instanced or proxied, and that you could do a fly-through of such a big environment is, I don't know, I just think it's nuts. So anyway, each one of those is a 100,000 poly tree. But yeah. So the other scene that I have, which is just me goofing around, really, is with proxies. Let me go inside here and find it. Sorry. We did that one. Proxy sphere. So you can see this one is 352 megs still. And I just made spheres that are emitting trees. Okay. So yeah, I have a sphere. So it was actually a cube that I smoothed. So I have a cube. Usually I use cubes and smooth them to make spheres because then you don't get a pull, like you don't get pinching at the top. Useful tip. So I made that and then made it an emitter, and I'm emitting a bunch of trees on it. And so this scene has the original trees in it still. So you can see they're in there. If I make them visible, they're in there somewhere, right there. But if I go to the next scene, which is Onyx Proxies Spheres 02, that scene, by the way, let me go in here. So Onyx Proxies Spheres 02. you can see is only 9 megabytes. And so that's because I deleted all of the original trees out of the scene. So all I have inside here are all of these cubes, which are actually all of these spheres. Each one is an emitter that's emitting particles into a single particle object, because you can connect one emitter to the same, or multiple emitters to the same particle object, and each emitter will add particles into that particle object. So each one of these cube spheres are emitters, but they're all connected to the same particle object via the dynamic relationships editor. So you can see that this one particle object is connected to all these emitters, and then this one instancer node is connected to that one particle object. And then we can see it has all of my proxy trees in it. And so in here on my particle object, I've got 25,000 trees, and so that's going to again be somewhere around 5 billion polygons. And so if we go to the render view window and open those up, there's my silly sphere trees things. And so here is just a bunch of spheres emitting trees. So this is about 5 billion polygons. You can see it's working with fog. And so this is rendering with volume fog inside here. So I have physical sun and sky, camera exposure, final gather, volume fog, and it all works with 5 billion polygons in here. So goofy, but kind of cool. So yeah, that's pretty much proxies. So the only thing is, as far as another caveat, is that you can take animated geometry and instance it very well. And so, as I've shown you already. So the thing we did with the eucalyptus trees using the lattice, I was able to take the trees that had lattice dynamic animation on them and instance them on the particle, and all the instances had the animation. In the Paint Effects tree DVD, we did the same thing with animated Paint Effects trees and put those onto instance copies, and that works fine. But with proxies, when you export your proxy, it doesn't export animation data. And so if you need to have animated trees, then that's not something you can easily do with Mental Ray Proxies. There is a way to do it, but it's extremely convoluted. It's not something that is easily done through the UI of Maya. And so hopefully that gets simpler. But you know, if you're rendering some massive vista with, you know, billions of polygons, and you need the trees to be blowing in the wind, I mean, how often do you see that avatar? Yeah, okay. So, but in the end, I think if you search online, you will find some threads where people are talking about some workarounds to try and get animation to work with Mental Ray Proxies. But I haven't needed to do that yet, and it is very convoluted, and so that's why it's not something that I'm including. So from the scenes and the level of complexity of what I think that you're probably going to end up needing to do, as you can see with instances, you can go up to 700 million polys with 12 gigs of RAM. So if you really need to do animated trees that are replicating all over your scene, I think that life will be a lot easier if you just buy some more RAM. Until this proxy thing with Mental Ray animated instances or Mental Ray animated proxies gets to be a little bit simpler. But very often the trees do not need to be animated. If I was going to do something that was a vista going off into the distance and the camera needed to move, I'd really just have the trees that are near the camera be instance copies with animation, and then the trees that are in the background or the midground and the background, which would account for probably the billions of polygons worth of trees that you'd have, would probably not need to be animated as far as the leaves blowing in the wind, and you wouldn't really notice it. So if you're intelligent about how you combine all of these techniques, I think you should be able to approach any kind of shot that you should need to do. So that pretty much wraps up Mental Ray Proxies. So you can see just a bunch of spheres inside here. So I've got these proxies, and each of them is referring to a .mi file. And then since I don't have the original trees in here, if I decide if I look at my render and I'm like, this tree here, its leaves are too bright, I want them darker, I'd have to figure out which tree is that. I'd have to go to the original scene that has that tree, edit its shader, and then re-export that tree as a new .mi file, and then find the associated proxy tree in here and either assign it this new edited mi file, or if I overwrote the old one, it would automatically update. So hopefully all that stuff about proxies made sense. So it's really, really easy and really cool. So cool. So that's it for Mental Ray Proxies. And I think at this point we've pretty much talked about just about everything that I wanted to cover on this DVD in regards to Onyx. And so, but we'll pause for a second so I can scratch my head and think about what we might talk about next, if anything. Alrighty, Mental Ray Proxies. And 11 billion polys, 4 billion polys, 1 billion polys. All right, cool. Moving on.